Hello, welcome to the first module of the course, the United States and the Global Economy. I wanted to just go over what we're going to be doing this week. First of all, the topic, I guess, it could be described as globalization. So how do we know that it's going on? So globalization is also increased international economic integration. So we'll look at what that means. And then how do we know if it's increasing or decreasing or what's happening with it? So we're going to look at the types of evidence that we can examine to see what's happening with it. And then we're going to have an overview of what's been happening since the middle of the 19th century on up through the present time. And so is globalization a new thing? Why is it increasing now? Is that significantly different than what's happened in the past? And then very quickly on the last one in module 01-4, just a preview of some of the themes that are going to be coming up in the course. So I wanted to start off with three basic questions that I think are pretty good to ask. So first is, what is it? So we hear that globalization's happening and it's increasing over time. So first of all, what is it? And then, has it been increasing over time more rapidly than it has in the past? And then lastly, if it's been going on, if it's increasing, is that something that we want to encourage? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? So first of all, what is it? So as the book says, it's the process of increased economic interdependence among nations. It's the interactions between the economic factors across nations and also their citizens. We're going to be looking at primarily the flow of goods and services and the flow of financial flows. So investments in equipment in other countries, factories in other countries, financial assets. So U.S. citizens purchasing foreign stocks, foreigners purchasing U.S. financial assets. So these are the two main aspects that we're going to be looking at: the flow of goods and services and financial flows. So as I said, it's the increased economic interdependence among nations. We're going to focus on the economic factors, but just to be aware that there are non-economic factors as well. So it's increasingly becoming one world, and so our cultures and people are being more integrated, and certainly the environment is becoming more integrated. So what's happening in China is affecting us. What's happening here is affecting other countries as well. We're not going to be focusing as much on these things. We will get to some of these later on in the course, but at least for the first part, we're going to be looking at trade flows and financial flows. So we're looking at trade flows are trade in goods and services with people in other countries. So for example, a person in California buys French wine, or a person in Sri Lanka buys a Dell laptop computer. So it's the flow of merchandise between people in other countries. Imports are stuff that's manufactured in other countries that we buy here. Exports are stuff that's manufactured here that we sell to people in other countries. So not only do we have trade flows, we also have flows of financial assets, so financial flows. And as we'll see later when we do the balance of payments, the flows of goods and services are tracked in the current account. The flow of financial assets are tracked in the capital account. They are intimately linked. And so financial flows, for example, are somebody in France invests in a U.S. T-bill, which they do. We need to finance our federal budget deficit. One way that we do that is the U.S. Treasury prints up T-bills, and U.S. citizens can buy them, and foreign citizens can buy them as well. So when a foreigner buys U.S. financial assets, such as a corporate bond, U.S. government bond, that's a flow of financial assets from one country to another. And as we'll see when we do the balance of payments, these two flows, the flows of goods and services and the flows of financial assets, are linked, inexorably linked. So we'll see why that is. So how do we know whether globalization is increasing, decreasing, or what is it? So as we said, we're going to focus on trade flows and capital flows. We'll look at trade flows first. The book makes the point that economies now are more integrated than they've been at any time in history. That is true. And the reason is because there's been, over the past 150 years, an inexorable march towards increased economic integration. We've got much faster communication. We've got transportation that is much quicker and much less costly than it was before. One example I use in class is a bottle of Heineken beer. So you would think that shipping a bottle of Heineken beer from Amsterdam in the Netherlands to the United States is going to be relatively costly. In fact, when you ship it by sea, and with the innovations in shipping, that it costs less than 1 cent to ship a bottle of Heineken beer from Amsterdam to the United States. Transportation costs are low now. In fact, we can export relatively low-valued material like sawdust from the United States, the Pacific Northwest, to Japan to make it into pressboard, and it's then shipped back across the Pacific to us. Transportation costs are low. Another key factor is the openness of our trading systems, trade agreements, multilateral trade negotiations, all of which have led to reducing the boundaries and obstacles of the flow between countries. So we've got low transportation costs, better and more instantaneous communication, and a system that promotes economic trade. With increased globalization, you have to have countries' economies have to be open to foreign trade. So one way that we measure that is, your book talks about the trade to GDP ratio. Other places it's called as the openness measure, or the openness index. So let's look at what it is. So it's a rough measure of the importance of international trade to a nation's economy, and you just add up all the exports that come in, that flow out of a country, plus all the imports that flow into a country. How big is the international trade sector relative to GDP? So it's imports plus exports over GDP. Doesn't say anything about a country's trade policies, what its trade barriers are. Obviously, if the trade barriers are higher, then you're going to have fewer imports and fewer exports, and lower. This is a rough measure of how open an economy is. So here is here's the ratio for different countries, and you'll see here's the Netherlands. So exports as a percentage of GDP, 69%. Imports as a percentage of GDP, 62%. Exports plus imports as a percentage of GDP is 131%. Question is, how can exports plus imports be greater than the GDP of the country as a whole? So when we look at, if you remember from introductory macroeconomics, when we count up GDP, GDP is consumer spending plus investment spending plus government spending plus net exports. Net exports are exports minus imports. Here we add exports plus imports and divide it by GDP. So if your exports are large and your imports are large, they can be larger than GDP because you're adding the two, not calculating net exports as we do when we calculate GDP. So when you look at, here's the Netherlands at 131%, and it goes down, in the United States and Japan are down at 25%. There's a couple of things that we'll notice here. Oh, here's the figure that's in your book, which basically shows, here's the trade to GDP ratio back in 1913, just before World War I. Again, look, here's the Netherlands. And so trade fell off sometime between 1913 and 1950. So that was World War I, the Great Depression, World War II. So trade, the amount of economic activity between nations fell. 1950 it bottomed, well, a little before then it bottomed out, and then since then it's increased. So here's 1973, here's where it is now. It's higher than it ever has been. It was high, fell down, and now it's back up. So here's the United States, relatively low. Here's Japan, relatively low. Here's the Netherlands, very high. So what we see is larger countries usually have a lower measure of openness, and so the trade to GDP ratio is lower for large countries than it is for small countries. Think about us in the United States. Where do we get most of our bread? We make it in, it's made locally. Where do we get most? If we go out for a restaurant, it's local. If we get milk, it's local. And so larger countries can make more of what their citizens consume than smaller countries. Smaller countries may not have a viable dairy industry, so they need to import that. So in general, large countries have a relatively lower measure of openness. Smaller countries generally have a higher measure of openness, just as a general rule. The United States, even though our GDP ratio is relatively low, it's 25%, because our economy is so huge, the volume of international trade is big. And so here's our trading partners. Our largest trading partner is with Canada. Second is China and Mexico, and then Japan, Germany, United Kingdom are all relatively large. Here's, as of 2010, here's our trading volumes, our exports and imports, total volume of trade. So like I said, Canada's our biggest, China second, closely followed by Mexico, and then the other ones drop off. So these are the big three for us. So that's the data for 2010. Here's a website for the Census Bureau, which much of this is, and I'm not going to go to it here, but you can put this in. I'll just show it to you very briefly. This is where you go to find out the latest. I think the latest right now is November from 2013. Lists our top 15 trading partners. And that's the end of the first lecture. And jump on over to lecture 01-1.